So this panel is Chinese leadership in global clean energy investment, green finance, sustainable infrastructure development. Let's tell you who's sitting here. Starting the far end of the stage, Michael Greenstone. You're probably familiar with him. Milton Friedman, professor in economics, the college and the Harris School, and the director of the Becker Friedman Institute. It's out of order. Here we go. There it is. Richard Sandor is chairman and CEO of the American Financial Exchange, the Aaron Director, lecturer in law and economics, the law school at the University of Chicago. Deborah, hold on, got this in different orders here. Wow. I thought I set this up. Here we go, is vice chairman of the Paulson Institute, which she helped launch, senior advisor to the chairman on US-China relations, and also helped to devise and establish the US-China Green Fund, which is going to be a significant part of our discussion today in terms of what they're seeing on the ground in terms of investments. Pin Ni is president of the Wanxiang America Corporation. It's a company he started in 1994. The company's revenues grew from $0 to $4 billion to date. It's all kinds of investments, automotive, clean energy, real estate, real on-the-ground investor with market-driven incentives. Good to have you all here. Michael, I'm going to start with you. If you could set the stage for us, Chinese leadership in green energy. What is the state of the environment and what's going on in China right now? You've got some good slides.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks. I'm going to break all the slide rules here at once. So I think this picture helps illustrate what I think of as the global energy challenge, of which China is really at the absolute center of it. And this picture, when I think of the global energy challenge, I think of it as a stool that has 3 legs. And all 3 legs are illustrated very clearly in this picture. This picture is from Beijing a couple years ago. And what you can see, and anyone who's been to China will recognize it, is like it's a place on the make. There's lots of motion, there's lots of action. It was not very long ago that our guy in the cab was probably on a bike, and it's not going to be very long till the guy in the bike is going to be in a car. And in the last 25 years or so, China has had, I think, a historically unprecedented increase in living standards. Almost all made it possible by enormous increases in energy consumption. And so the first leg of the stool is how do you make sure that societies get access to the inexpensive and reliable source of energy that are necessary for improvements in living standards. All that's embedded in that picture. The second leg of the stool is also embedded in that picture, and that's in the process of doing that, how do you avoid severe health and environmental problems associated with that energy consumption? And so it's the middle of the day, and you can't see the sun. That happens in Beijing, some less than it used to. And everyone is aware of it. The guy on the bike has the mask on, and you can tell people are cognizant that this growth has come, the downside of that has been exposure to air pollution and health problems associated with that. The third leg of the stool is also visible, or it's not visible in this picture, but you know it's there, which is the same fossil fuels that are driving all this income growth and causing all this pollution are also involved in the release of CO2. And that CO2 is increasing the odds of disruptive climate change. So I view that as the global energy challenge. How can societies, particularly China, find ways to balance between all 3 of those goals? It's not hard to think of policies that are going to be effective at achieving 1 or sometimes 2 of those goals, but to get all 3 are going to require trade-offs. And so let me talk about those for a couple minutes. So this is just some data about leg 1 of the stool. And in economics, you don't really often see graphs like this. What it reveals is just an enormous increase in energy consumption, which drove most of that income growth. So between 1990 and 2010, energy consumption went up by a factor of 3. You can see going out to 2040, there's expected to be very large further increases in energy consumption. And importantly, the 3 gray bars or blobs at the bottom of there are the fossil fuels. And so much of that occurred because of fossil fuels and is projected, as you go out to 2040, to continue to be driven, the energy consumption, by fossil fuels. By 2040, fossil fuels are projected to still account for 80% of total fuel consumption energy in China. Okay, so that's leg one. Leg two, that air pollution that was so visible and was obscuring the sun in Beijing. Here's some where the USChina and the BFI, we're going to release something called an Air Quality Life Index in a couple weeks. And here's a map that comes from it. This is a map using satellite data of PM 2.5 concentrations in China. And you can see that the average person lives with about 40 micrograms per cubic meter of PM 2.5. That's against the WHO, the World Health Organization, standard of about 10 micrograms per cubic meter. Now, what are the consequences of that? So what are the consequences of the guy driving the bike and having to breathe in air like that? The second part of this Air Quality Life Index is it provides a way to measure that. And here, the different colors relate to the number of years of life expectancy that would be gained if each of those areas were brought into compliance with the WHO standards. And so at countrywide, the average person, and if the entire country was brought into compliance, the average person would gain about 3 years of life expectancy. And now, this is a first that we're going to try and pull off a live action slide, but let's see how this goes. And what it will show you is how that varies across different parts of the country. You can see that from the colors, but hopefully we'll do this with some animation here. Okay, now there's China's, okay, so we're moving to different regions. And this data is available at the district level. And we're going to zoom in on Beijing. So in the case of Beijing, the average person would live about 6 years longer if Beijing's air quality were brought into compliance with WHO standards. And it just underscores this tension between all the energy consumption that has happened and that people want to continue to have that has to be balanced against the pollution problems. Now, the third leg of the stool that I want to highlight is the possibility of disruptive climate change. So these same fossil fuels that are causing all that air pollution are also increasing the odds of disruptive climate change in the world. And to put it into perspective how critical China's role is in resolving this problem, I created this graph which shows the share of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere that are due to three big countries, the United States, India, and China, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to the present. And you can see that in the United States case, although we're only 300 million people, we account for almost 18% of those emissions. India is about 4%, and China is 12%. But what I want you to see is, and this is cumulative, I'm going to now move forward in time to 2050. And you can see that this starts to change quite dramatically. The United States share is down to 16%, and you can see the Chinese share really start to increase. And if you go to the end of the century, what will be true under standard projections is that by the end of the century, China will account for about a quarter of all cumulative emissions. And what that highlights is, it doesn't take, without taking a stand on who should pay for it, that there is no solution to the climate problem that doesn't run through greatly altered reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from China. So to summarize, I think the Chinese and the global energy challenge all involve these three goals, some of which are in conflict with each other, that China and the world are going to have to navigate as we move on.
Thank you for setting the stage. That's perfect. As I like to do, refer now, most of the times first, in this case you're second, but generally to our visitor from China who can help speak about the situation firsthand. Pin, tell me, you have an investment fund.
Sure.
I assume that part of your investment thesis is helping to eliminate some of the problems that Michael is talking about. Tell us about what you're doing in terms of investments when it comes to green energy there and what impact it's having. Sure.
So I just recognize the difference between professional and non-professional.
He's a professor. You're
yeah, I'm student.
You're an active doer.
I couldn't
you're a
get
doer.
into UC.
Yeah.
So So I don't have the PowerPoint.
We like to talk, you like to do.
Yeah. But I do have, a bunch of experience, good experience and a bad experience. So let's be honest, many years ago when we started business in the United States, our goal was very simple, just to make money. As much as you can, as fair as you can. Then our chairman really set up a goal to say, hey, while we are making the parts for the auto industry, which would create a lot of pollution. One of the reasons for Beijing, everybody is complaining about is the bumper to bumper, the car produce so much pollution, so, it's a major issue. So the goal set up at the time was saying, hey, let's try to see if we can look into the clean energy space. And is that feasible? Is that possible? Business-wise, would that be a smart business decision? And so forth and so on. So we had a lot of debate. And I personally at that time did not believe it. And the reason I didn't believe it is because I do see a lot of government money coming. And I usually would like to say, the government money usually screw up the industry, not helping the industry. And
you'd fit in fine here at the University of Chicago, by the way.
Oh, okay. So now I can put on my resume. And but one thing I missed at that time was the technology impact. And I remember we were in the D.C. for the energy conference between U.S.-China. And Secretary Chu, he was the he was the Secretary for the Department of Energy. And he was talking about the solar industry. That was 2011 in January. He was talking about, Hank knows this. And the solar industry, he say, actually he published a paper saying that hopefully one day the solar industry will be at 50 cents per watt. At that time, it will be equal to the other energy source. And so people can afford it. It doesn't need to be the government subsidy anymore. And we were building the plant in Rockford, Illinois, not too far from here. And our budget was $3.50 per watt at that time. And we have a contract for $4. So it was great, it was wonderful. And now, yesterday when we had our weekly meeting, the market price is about 38 to 41 cents.
Wow.
So even Secretary Chu was wrong because he was thinking, far down the road, this is going to be there. But now we only are 7, 8 years, and not only the solar energy is affordable, but to some extent, in many other cases, it's more competitive energy source.
So just so I understand, so it's 38 cents to 41 cents per kilowatt? Is that the
we talk about per watt.
Per watt, okay.
Yeah, per watt. And so we see the solar, sort of rolled it out, very, very quickly.
Coal is what per watt?
I would say, let me give you another example on the coal side. China has a huge reserve on the coal, especially on the west part of China. So due to the transportation logistic cost, was not economically feasible to get the coal from there to the East Coast.
Heavy to ship.
Yeah, which is the major demand for the energy consumption, in China's on the East Coast. So many years ago, we looked at the technology in the United States, a great technology originally invented by Shell. It's called coal gasification. Mm-hmm. So it's ideal because natural gas is in such short, supply situation in China. So if you can get the coal gasified, that will change everything. So we put up more than $100 million in that company, and after 3 years, we realized it's not going to go. And in fact, not only us, I think China has done more than 11 or 12 billion-dollar coal gasification project by Sinopec, by Datom, by many other companies. Every single one of them failed.
Failed.
Yeah, it's not about technology of the coal gasification. It's about the shale gas technology. It completely changed the landscape, and the gas prices, got pushed down so low, the coal gasification is no longer feasible. So that is another lesson.
But I guess what I'm just trying to get at is when you talk about 38 cents to 41 cents, which is much lower than what you were thinking, where does it fit competitively versus fossil fuels? I mean, when I see that chart that Michael put up, and coal's going to be one of the biggest suppliers, it says to me that's got to be because it costs less.
Yes, so I would say, you know, again, depending on the region, if you are in Hawaii, the electricity costs you could up to 20-some cents per kilowatt hour.
Yeah.
If you're in Chicago, in the suburb, it's about 4 cents
Yep.
without the delivery cost, which is ComEd charge, you know, no matter how. So I would say the solar energy cost. Now this is only the panel. So you have installation, you
Yep.
have an inverter, you have all the others. So it could be anywhere, you know, between the 4 to 6 cents, and you can still make money on your solar farm, which we have. You know, we have one in Radford. If we didn't make money by making the solar panel, we made a lot of money on the producing electricity.
Okay, I guess I'm still to the 38 to 41 cents on the renewables versus what on the fossils?
No, that's
I'm confused.
on the panel cost
Yeah.
per watt.
Okay,
When
that's
you-
a renewable, right?
Yeah. When you
yeah.
convert,
Yeah.
when you convert
Yeah.
into the kilowatt hour,
Yeah.
which is the energy cost, it could be anywhere between 4 to 6 to 8 cents, depending on your installation cost.
Okay.
So that's where we are. So I would say the solar is very competitive. Obviously, it's a less cost competitive if you only install 5 panel on the roof, which is going to be a lot more costly.
But scale.
Compared to you build on the vacant land, the land has no real estate tax on there. You can, you know, it's very easy mount the solar panel.
Okay.
Then you can be very competitive.
To fossil fuels. Got
That
it.
is correct.
Deborah, tell us what the Paulson Institute is doing and the US-China Green Fund.
Great. Before I get into the details, I just wanted to set the stage just a little bit on the green finance issue, because I know during this conference there's been a lot of discussion about US-China relations and the tensions that are rising. And typically, as we have followed these issues, there are 3 areas of cooperation between the 2 countries. One, you know, security and diplomacy, foreign policy, trade and investment, and the other was cooperation on sort of the common good issues, and climate change fell right in the center of that. And as the administration is moving away as a policy issue from climate change, China is the one who is out there kind of leading the charge. And as we've heard a lot, and as Michael was saying, China is the big player, and what China decides to do will have an impact not only globally, will have an impact on America's interests. And China has demonstrated that they've got the political will to try and address a lot of these issues, but as we have seen through Paris, there's lots of countries who have the political will and the good intentions to try and address climate change, but they've come across one major obstacle, and that's how to pay for it. And as China is looking at what its obligations are in the green finance area and meeting its obligations on climate change, estimates are it's going to be almost $1 trillion per year for the foreseeable future, and the government can only cover about 15% of those costs. So therefore, they have to look at how they can put together the right combination of market mechanisms, of enforcement, of policy, of incentives, to then attract the type of capital necessary to finance their change and address those challenges that Michael was talking about. China has announced a very ambitious policy around green finance. In fact, Xi Jinping in May announced that they were going to really expand what they're doing. 2 years ago, China launched green bonds, and already in their first year, they were actually the largest issuer in the world. Ironically, the US took over last year as #1. This year, they're on track again to be the largest in the world. China launched a national carbon market, and I know that we'll hear a lot more about what's going on in the carbon area, but just because it's China, by the mere fact that it launched this, it was one industry, 7,000 companies that are trading on it or hoping to be trading on it, but already it's the largest carbon market in the world. And China's the leader in fintech, and fintech is getting into the game to try and gamify behavior around climate change and helping this transition to low carbon. In fact, Ant Financial has a game that it has participants larger than the population of the United States, and it's a game, and maybe many people here play it, it's on WeChat, but a game where you compete against what your carbon footprint is each day, and you earn points, and you can build a tree online, and when you actually build that tree, it's a commitment they have with an NGO to go out and plant a tree, and they have planted 15 million trees in about the 2 years that they've actually had this game going on, and so you can see how it starts to change behavior. And China is seeking very innovative ways to try and price pollution. They're now looking at how they can set up and put a price on the right to pollute the air, to pollute the soil, and to pollute water. So in addition, in the steps that they're doing at home, China's also hoping to become a major exporter of green finance. And this is going to have implications around the world and implications for the United States. They are already in discussions with countries in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, and in Africa about setting up carbon exchanges, for example. And they would set these standards up by a Chinese standard, by Chinese rules, and allow then these companies to be able to trade on China's national carbon exchange. And the Belt and Road, Xi Jinping's big foreign policy effort, is another major initiative. China has pledged that it is going to have green standards applied in the build out for this, and there's a huge amount of need for infrastructure building. The ADB actually estimates that there's about $8 trillion needed to build out just in Asia, the infrastructure there. But if that building isn't done right, it's going to have serious implications. And there are estimates that have been done recently by the UN to look at this, that if the build out isn't done by green standards, within 10 years, that build out and the BRI countries could have a carbon footprint that's 3 to 4 times larger than China's is today. So the implications are significant. So it's important both that they get the standards right, but we find creative ways to look to finance these. And so that's what the Paulson Institute is focused on. And we're looking at a number of different things. One is working on voluntary financial standards for countries who are providing lending to the Belt and Road. But we also set up about 2 years ago the US-China Green Fund. And the focus of the fund is to look at finding and sourcing the most innovative US technologies, and not bringing the company, but bringing the product to China and deploying them. And one of the biggest obstacles, it's a very simple thing, in employing these technologies is people just don't know how to use them. So we have a center that works in training contractors and architects and others of how you actually deploy these technologies and creating greater energy efficiencies. And our start had been focused on building energy efficiencies, and actually today is the 2nd year anniversary of the launch of our fund.
So we want to get to more of that, but I'd like to get Mr. Richard involved here. She's talking about carbon exchanges. You helped establish one of the first ones in China. Weigh in what you've heard here. I know you've brought some great slides, too.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. This university has helped me realize my life and my dreams, and my mentor, Ronald Coase, helped me steer my way towards climate exchanges per se. I want to pick up on what Michael said, because I think that there is a general lack of understanding how powerful pricing and externality can be. And if we take a look at the
Pricing and externality, pricing the cost of a repercussion of something.
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And in 1960, Coase wrote an article on the theory of social costs, and he suggested that there were other ways besides command and control and taxes and subsidies.
Command and control when the government from the top decides this is the way it's going to be versus a market system. Right.
And so in the seeds of that were a market system. And in a market system, you put a cap on the amount of emissions, and then if Richard Energy can't reach his cap because he's not good at it and hasn't got enough land to build a scrubber or a device to take things out of the air. But Deborah Energy is Michael Energy, are far better, and they can innovate. They can reduce more or get below their cap, and Richard Energy can buy it, and yet systemically we've reduced. So that's called cap and trade. In the United States in the 80s, we had a vast problem with acid rain. You know, even Michael Douglas made movies like Black Rain. It was a metaphor for the end of Western civilization as we know it. And if you take a look at concentrations of
okay, here comes
acid rain,
your graphics.
this is what it looked like. Rivers were being acidified. People were dying of lung diseases.
Rivers caught on fire. They were so polluted. There were moments it was so bad.
Yeah, it was like London.
Not in Chicago, but in Cleveland.
Okay.
Never in Chicago. So we passed something called the Clean Air Act. In 1990, it called for a reduction first of 50% and then 75% to be phased in over a decade. And that act passed. And one important thing is we did the first trade, the predecessor to my company, and it wasn't actually carbon trading, buying and selling SO2. Everybody thinks of this as a market. It was actually a financing transaction. There was a utility in Kentucky that had to build a $50 million scrubber. They were going to borrow and do construction financing and then bond the rest of it, finance it through bonds. And the city was highly leveraged. The interim construction financing was high. Building the scrubber was $50 million. We went to them and said, forget all of that. By the time you build your scrubber, you will be well below the cap. So we will present value, that is, take 30 years of SO2 reductions, give you $300 a ton, and then we will sell that to a Carolina utility that had no acreage to build a scrubber. So if you look at it, it looks like trading of tens of thousands of tons of that. It was nothing more than financing a construction in Henderson, Kentucky, and then finding the hedge. It had, excuse me, we had to finance on the other side and issue a zero and do a whole bunch of things, but ultimately it was financing. So what happened in the United States after 1990? And I think the next map is instructive. We went from 18 million tons down to 9 million tons, down to 4.5 million tons, and we're now at a 90% reduction. Following on Michael's work, which I have such great regard for, we don't put it in the context of human lives and what it means. So what did that mean? If you go to the EPA website, that first 9 million, which was low-hanging fruit, really, according to the EPA, reduced medical expenditures by $148 billion, okay, annually, at a cost of $3.5 to $4 billion. I don't know.
Total.
Total.
I want to understand something. The progress that was made, you're suggesting it was because of the Clean Air Act or because of this financing tool that drove
it
incentives?
It was the Clean Air Act which put a price on SO2 emissions, some of it to be used for financing, some of it to be used for trading and annual compliance. The point I'm trying to make is sometimes what's thought as an annual trading system can be a 30-year stream and could be a financing technique. So it's not just buying and selling Apple stock or soybeans or cryptocurrencies. It's actually a financing tool as well as an annual.
Are they doing the same in China?
The question is perfect, and I'll get into that. China, by comparison, has 36 million tons of emissions versus 18 million at our type. If you do the math, arithmetic, and say we had 150 billion annual gains and 9 million tons of reduction, there's 4 times the population density in China, so the health effects are such.
Huge.
I make it back of the envelope kind of 6th grade economics, that's a $1 trillion drag on the Chinese economy. And
In healthcare costs.
in healthcare costs annually, 10% potentially of GDP. We're talking, and that's one pollutant. That's not NOx, it's not mercury, and it doesn't even touch on carbon. So let me kind of, with the 3 minutes I have left, tell you.
1 minute, yeah.
Then I'll wait till the Q&A. We started the first climate exchange in China, and actually our job was to raise awareness, and our job was to coin something called climate exchange. We did it when we coined something in '74 called derivatives. You have to have a name for something, and it can't be complicated, and everybody has to sum it up.
Branding is important, yes.
Branding. So we were there to brand, raise awareness, and educate. The U.S., quickly, you pass a law, you get the Environmental Protection Agency, then you build an exchange, and then you design the contract. 4 elements of costs. China, nothing like that. You set off in 2005, you visit NDRC, you visit MEP, you visit MOST, the Ministry of Science and Technology, you visit CSRC. You have to find a strategic partner. In our case, it was CNBC. You make 30 trips there, and you host from morning to breakfast to evening. You speak at universities, you lecture, you build a brand. And the final point is we ran a public company. We got a great bid. We sold it out. We own 25% of the Tianjin Climate Exchange. And for those who might be skeptical about China and where it's going, we sold it to the New York Stock Exchange. Ultimately, those shares became owned by Alibaba 6 months ago. So this is telling me something. When the high-tech companies and the fintech companies end up owning a share in a climate exchange in the city of Tianjin, it's I think, something we should be aware of.
Michael, I see you wanting to weigh in here.
Yeah, so since I made more slides than everyone else, I thought I would
Oh, yeah, that's the other one.
turn to this. So I think what Richard has
Can we
highlighted.
bring up the slide that he's got here on the screen in front of him? Thank you.
Yeah, I think what Richard has highlighted is, China has these multiple goals. One is how to keep consuming lots of energy in the name of further economic growth, incredibly important goal. And the second is how do you do that without also leading to the health problems that Richard was talking about. What's very striking is that I think they're pursuing multiple approaches. So through Richard's work on the carbon exchange, they're using kind of market-based approaches that are been shown over and over to be the most cost-effective. Simultaneous, there's also in 2013, the Premier declared a war on pollution and really turned particulates pollution, which is the source of the largest health problems, put that right in the bullseye. And in 4 short years, there have been incredible reductions across the country, maybe 20 to 40%. This is illustrated here. The white areas are areas where there isn't monitoring. And just to put it in context, in 4 years, they achieved pollution reductions that it took the U.S., after the passage of the Clean Air Act in 1970, a dozen years and 2 vicious recessions. China continued to grow, and they got 20 to 40% reductions. If those reductions are sustained, they can expect to have improvements of life expectancy of about 2.5 years. So as Richard was highlighting, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. Now, currently, unlike with CO2, with particulates, they're pursuing that in very ham-handed kind of command and control ways, shutting down businesses, declaring that you can't use coal, and without allowing markets to work. And I think the challenge going ahead will be to get further reductions or sustain the ones they've achieved, but to do that in a more cost-effective way. And I think that's in front of them to be grabbed, and Richard has highlighted that markets for pollution can work in China.
I think there was a slide up here.
Backwards, maybe.
Backwards?
Yeah.
That one?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Bring this up.
I
This is the
think
map of the world.
what's interesting, if you take a look at the use of markets as a tool, you'll notice some in Mexico, you'll see in California, you'll see a European Union ETS, you'll see the beginning of markets in India and China. It's important to note that the adoption of market-based solutions to environmental challenge is directly proportional to the distance from Washington, D.C. The further you go, the more there is the adoption of markets. And in particular, look carefully at California, which has now a bipartisan cap and trade program, and look to China. And if one takes a look at progressions and financial innovations, and the ones that I've had some experience in, whether it's the Dutch East India Company in 1605, I didn't have experience in that, or acid rain, or ginny maize, or wheat trading, it's a 20-year cycle. And same as power steering, which was invented in the
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but here's the thing. Michael put up a slide earlier that showed that actually U.S. emissions are going down, and the data shows that. So I understand, okay, they've got, the further away you get from Washington, the more likely you are to have some kind of market-based system. But it sounds to me like we have actually been very efficient with the private sector here in achieving some of these reductions that we'd like to, right? I mean, compared to other parts of the world. Square those two things for me. This is,
yeah,
am I reading the data wrong?
There's a couple of things. You have, and I think is very important to understand for the audience, if you take a look at the size of the gold open interest, which is, in fact...
Gold open interest. So if you trade gold, how many people are interested, to generalize, how many people are interested in trading gold? Yes.
What percentage do you think environmental markets in North America would be of gold? Would they be 10%? What is a...
I don't understand the question.
If the gold market is at X, what percentage would environmental markets...
In terms of how many people want, what would the open interest be at the environmental?
Yeah.
You're saying it's less or more? I don't, and I...
Well, one would think gold is a pretty widely traded commodity and that it's worldwide of interest. Anybody here know of environmental markets in the United States? Probably not. You will be surprised to learn that North American environmental markets are 20% bigger than the gold market in the United States. Between California, RGGI, renewable energy certificates.
That's dollar volume, that's contract volume?
Contract outstanding.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Breadth of the market.
And is that why we have the numbers that I talked about?
I think it's far more pervasive. And
okay.
What others saying, there's a price out there at the local level for renewable energy, for RECs. There's a lot of buying for voluntary markets. And a lot of this is spurred by price of carbon or anticipation of a regulatory regime that might come back. And so the technology, of course, is fostered by a million other things, wind, efficiency, solar, an inexorable trend away from coal. I served on the board of American Electric Power, which was the biggest consumer of coal in North America. In my class here, we had the CFO come last year, right after the announcement that coal is going to be revived out of Washington, D.C., and he said quite flatly, we will never build another coal plant in North America.
Because it's not economical.
Natural gas.
Other things have come down in price.
It took to build anything, the environmental lawsuits, the risks, the PUCs, all of these things make coal is a civilization gone with the wind. It's not coming back.
On that note, I want to talk to, we get Pin in here because Michael mentioned the command and control, the back and forth decisions, instead of maybe using market incentives, just simply shutting down businesses because they pollute. What's that like on the ground for you as an investor in these kind of technologies?
Sure. There's no doubt, first of all, I would say the Chinese government is more effective, more efficient in terms
China's
of
market?
China government.
Chinese government.
Yeah. So that is the issue in terms of, one is that, obviously they can shut down the plant very easily, and but it's not market-based, initiative. Nope. So in the long term, it could have impact. But I just want to echo what Michael was just talking about. China took 2-3 years, to the war on the pollution.
Incredible achievement.
Yeah. Now at least you can still see the blue sky in Beijing now. Actually, when I saw your picture, it remind me a joke in Beijing. A taxi driver and didn't see the stoplight, so he ran through. So he was complaining. He said, "Jesus, I'm going to get a ticket." So the passengers sit back and say, "No, you're not. If you didn't see the stoplight, how could the camera see you?"
Yeah.
How could the camera see you? Mm-hmm. So it was very bad at that time because I remember we have customers, we want to set up a meeting in Beijing. Usually people say, no, we want to go to Shanghai. Or better is in Hong Kong. So it is very effective, no doubt. But
they don't want to go because the pollution's too high.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct. I have one guy moved back to Beijing. He had to install the air filter in every single room he has. Mm-hmm. And then he say he doesn't even go out. If he goes out, he will, just like in the picture, he wear the mask. So anyway, so that is very effective, but it does come with a lot of penalty. That's the balance the Chinese government is struggling with, no doubt. Because last year, I remember in November, December, we basically couldn't get any product out of China at the time. The reason was the central government, the local government all commingled together with the private business or business there. They don't want to shut down any plant. So it was, I call this Tom Jerry game, So the central government will have to send an auditing team and the two, where our headquarters is in Hangzhou. So they will send the team down there and they will shut down plant. And the funny part was that the shutdown is from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And then a lot of plant, they know how to play this game, so they will go back in the plant in the midnight, open it up, and then finish the production before 7 a.m. So nothing happened when the team came back. So the team recognized, and they came back and they did the second shift. Yeah. So there's a lot of those kind of things going on at the time. And it was effective, no doubt. It was very, very effective. But I still like what, Richard, you were talking about. At the end, those kind of a market, based tool or initiative, then really that make this more as economic logical for the business to pursue. So from that point of view, I would say, Deborah, you guys did a fantastic job. China is learning on that side. And when you have very effective government tool, then you probably don't want to pay too much attention on the other side because it's a slow, it's an educational process.
You keep using the word effective. You mean rapid, right? I mean, we would call it almost ineffective sometimes, right? But
depending on if Chicago standard or not.
Yeah, exactly. And command and control, right? Yeah. You're going to shut that plant down because we said so. Right?
That is correct.
Right.
But when I say effective, at least I couldn't recognize, I went to Beijing, I think, a few months ago. It was completely different when we landed. The last, before that time, when we landed in the airplane, I was talking about, I said, yeah, this is like a 5 p.m. or 4 p.m. in the afternoon. How come it's that foggy? They said, no, it's not foggy, it's just smog. You just couldn't see the runway. And so a few months ago when I was there, it is blue sky, no doubt. So it is there, it happened.
And it's improving.
It's a significantly improved, but at what kind of cost? That's really the issue. Now, one of the things we were just talking upstairs, and I say the private businesses are losing the confidence regarding investing more in the business today. One reason was the environmental control, because I have some friend, they have their workshop, they say, you know what, it's too much hassle, I'm not going to go forward. So I'm just going to shut down the plant and then move on, And For example, the air quality inside the manufacturing plant, nobody cares before. Now you have an OSHA standard type of sense. You got to have a window, you got to have fan, you cannot let the smoke out of the grinding equipment, so you got to do a lot of sense. So the cost is increased, there's no doubt.
And it raises that whole question that you brought up at the beginning, the growth versus the environment. Deborah, go ahead and weigh in here about what the U.S.-China Green Fund is doing in terms of trying to tackle these very enormous problems there.
Great. We had decided to start with buildings because about 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions in China come from energy efficient buildings or energy inefficient buildings. And so that's what we started. And so have been working on actually buying and managing energy service companies, ESCO companies, who will source the product and then go in and actually apply them. And in the 2 years that we've been in business, we've seen, and I should say the Paulson Institute's a non-commercial advisor as a not-for-profit. We're not involved in the commercial side, but we track this very carefully. We've seen about returns of about 30% in the fund. And you can see that there are real opportunities for companies and using these market mechanisms to be investing. And we've seen a significant difference, as Pin is saying, in what's been happening in energy efficient buildings. Because in the infrastructure, they're now being very strict about applying the standards. The enforcement is the thing that's really critical. I think that gets to the point of the shutting down of the factories. It's been very random, and in many cases, it's been that they've been shut down for political reasons. If there's a big meeting going on, like the APEC, they shut down all the factories for a certain period of time. They've been unwilling to close down factories permanently because of the job loss issue, and we're starting to see that all kind of becoming much more systematic. And that, I think, is just an issue of over time, that as they start to create the channels for market mechanisms to work, we're going to see more progress.
Michael, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think there's this tension between the absolute need for continued economic growth and what has now become an enormous political priority for dealing with pollution. And what I hear is a common view, which I certainly agree with here, is thus far, at least in the case of particulate pollution, that has not been executed by using markets. It's been used, you can't operate between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. or all these, you have to shut down this factory. The solution is just staring people in the face, which is to grab hold of markets in the way Richard described. And that, I think, is the best way to navigate and minimize the tension and the trade-off between the need for economic growth and continued environmental improvement.
What kind of impact are we seeing when it comes to all of this technology and what China's trying to do when it comes to the trade war? Is there a direct impact when it comes to, I don't know, are there products that you'd like to bring in that now have high tariffs on them, or how's that playing out? Deborah, do you see effects?
I would say, as I started with, I think it's not so much in the tariff war per se, but in the lack of willingness to cooperate on projects. And so a lot of the areas where there was the US and China uniting in, whether it's in our kind of fund, which is looked at suspiciously because it's focused on technology, to some of the other entities that were set up between government to government, that those discussions have broken down, or that they're tackling not only the issues climate change within China, but together in third countries, all of that has stopped. And so I think that's one of the things that's going to have an impact, is potentially detrimental to the US, because then it's China's standards who are going to dominate.
I think natural gas is an area that is lurking as a potential real problem. I think China would love to stop using so much coal, and as been said, there's not enough natural gas there, and we're just swimming in the stuff. And so the trade war could interrupt very profitable trades between the U.S. of natural gas from the shale and being exported to China. And I think, in principle, that would help China solve both of its economic growth and pollution, but the trade war could disrupt that.
I think it would also help solve this trade deficit obsession that the president has, right? If we started selling them a lot more natural gas, even if it's inefficient maybe to go that long a distance. But go ahead, Pin.
Yeah, so, we're saying a perfect example about this global cooperation, why this is important in the clean energy space. So, again, the same situation. In 2010, the battery for the electrical vehicle costs about $1,000 per kilowatt hour. So it's not economically feasible to have electrical vehicle without a government subsidy. So we saw the Leaf, like Georgia, if they cancel the subsidy, then the sales drop 90% right away. However, now the battery price last year is $209 per kilowatt hour. And now with the current trend, it's going to be $100 kilowatt hour by 2025. So what does that mean? By 2022, not even 2025, by 2022, when you get down to 125, 130, no subsidies are ever needed, and the electrical vehicle will be equal economically to the combustion engine vehicles. So that means that they're right on the corner. It's not too far. So now, I was asked the other day, what we're doing in the United States. I say, unfortunately, we're not doing much because, the activity going on is in China. And also, even Europe is way ahead of us in today in terms of electrical vehicle. So the interesting part is they say, oh, okay, then, USA is isolated. I say, no, that's not necessarily true. The very interesting part is that the core technology, even today, for the next generation, which is a solid-state battery, all those technology are still concentrated in the United States, whether it's in Boston or San Francisco, and MIT or
Caltech.
Yeah, Caltech or whichever.
Chicago.
We have Argonne here, and they are very good on the solid state as well. So it's kind of interesting to say we're developing so much technology here. Billions of dollars have been invested. We were looking at one company out of San Francisco, and they have A, B, C, D sample. The A sample, D sample is 4 years down the road. The company already worth $1.5 billion, and they don't even have the A sample yet. So there's a lot of money being spent in there. So if we have the market isolated, or if we have disconnection to the other part of the market, then this technology really have no use. So I can see that's not going to be possible. No matter how we describe the trade war or whatever, eventually I think of that issue. I call this as a gravity issue. The gravity will pull us together. There's no choice.
We're going to take questions from the audience or people walking around with cards. We're going to start that in about 5 minutes. So please, if you have questions, fill out the cards. Here's something I don't understand about the move toward electric cars. To me, that just means you need a much bigger power grid to power the cars. And power grids, at least in this country, are driven by coal and natural gas, right? Maybe nuclear, but they're not. So you get rid of the gasoline, the petroleum fossil fuel, but it's just a different reliance on something else.
It's a very big debate, yes.
Right.
And the best argument, I'm not necessarily saying I 100% agree, but the best argument is that the power plant is industrial scale and industrial technology, which you have much better control. Consumer product, which is the car, you have much less control. So the pollution, if there is a pollution, one is a controllable, centralized, you can deal on much bigger scale. One is random on the street. You just cannot deal with it. So that was the best argument I have seen so far. And they do, I think McKinsey.
But I'm right to ask about the trade-off, right? Because I think a lot of people think, when I drive this electric car, it's much better environmentally. But if you're plugging it into a coal-fired plant
it's called coal energy versus gasoline energy, something like that. So that was the worst, on this side.
Right. Richard?
Well, we have to think about the way the grid is going. Distributed power, building 1,000-mile transmission line or 500 or even 100 is very expensive.
Yes.
And I was on the board, again, of a utility. We built a 90-mile transmission line from West Virginia, where the coal was, to Virginia. And the project took 18 years, 17 years of permitting and 11 months to build. This whole nature of being a federal republic and not allowing electricity to be shipped from one state to the other, Texas has its own grid. I think we have to take a look at distributed power and what's happening in wind and solar, and are we going to have the need for, and will the grid go the way of telephone lines in the ground and all of a sudden stop being built a decade from now, and transmission as a business is not a very attractive business.
That would have to mean that one of Michael's slides was very incorrect about its prediction, right? Because there's that slide. I don't know if you remember the projection for usage in the future. If we can bring that back up, I think it was slide number 2. Coal is still expected to be the largest provider of energy. Is it wrong?
Those aren't incompatible. I think Michael and I would agree, and I would agree that the displacements of technology take a significant amount of time.
No, keep going. It's number 2, slide number, I think, or maybe 3. It was that one right there.
Yeah.
Doesn't this tell me that the greatest source of supply in 2040 for energy is coal?
But Michelle, your question is spot on. And actually, let's just level set. In the U.S., I think it's roughly half the places in the U.S., it is actually more CO2 polluting to use an electric vehicle than a combustion engine car currently.
Okay, that's what I didn't want to say, but yes, that's what I thought. Okay.
So why does all this talk about electric vehicles? I think the bright green future, what you have to have in mind, I think the most likely play to get there is enormous improvement in the efficiency of batteries. Yeah. And that's what Pim was talking about. Yes. Because that would drive down the cost of electric vehicles, but then to your point of where it's going to draw the electricity, that would unleash renewables on the grid. They would in principle drive out coal and natural gas. That's the theory. It doesn't have to happen, but that's the theory, that the bright green future runs through the battery, is my view.
Everybody's in agreement there. Okay, you want to hand me one or two that you like. There you go. Okay, thank you. What is your opinion on the U.S.'s withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, and what impact is this having on China?
I think it's irrelevant, and that we have trends going on. We have state and local. I think it was Brandeis who said that states are the laboratories, and if you take a look at California and its trading markets and things like that, the trends that Pim's talking about, the adoption, I don't think it really, the headlines aren't important.
What country is doing the most to reduce, what country's been the most effective in reducing their emissions?
Europeans have been fantastic. Scandinavian, Northern Europe.
How's the U.S. doing?
U.S. is doing very well, given there is no federal functioning in the area.
I guess the point I'm trying to get at is that...
a half full guy here. I'm a little half empty.
Okay.
Yeah, it's true. The fracking revolution is driving coal out in the U.S. system, and there's been improvements in renewables. But this is like a global problem. There's a lot of exporting of pollution to other countries, and I think the U.S. dropping out greatly reduced pressure on the rest of the world to increase the aggressiveness of their targets, and I think we're going to bear the fruit of that.
But is there something to be said about, we're so focused on market solutions? I mean, isn't the Paris Climate Accord this great government dictate, all these federal, together we're going to deem that this is what capital will flow to where we say it should? And
no,
you've just spent this whole discussion about how,
that's like a couple,
and the U.S. isn't a member, and yet our emissions are going down.
No, that's not true.
No, I think that Michael said again, because I go where there's nothing, I tend to have to be an optimist, and I have to be accustomed to failure and look at everything as a clinical experiment. But yeah, the Paris Accord comes, it goes, all of a sudden the price of carbon is $5 a ton in Europe, and then the European Commission meets and said, okay, the targets were too low, let's make it 24% from 19 to 22, then make it 12, price of carbon goes from 5 to 25. So there's a lot happening outside the US, and one could take a bleak view or a positive, and I think it's a half full, half empty thing. But it's a very important question. And the question that I hear is that the reaction of no national policy is putting enormous pushback pressure on people who weren't involved in the environmental movement, students, young people who are now seeing, hey, there's nothing going on in Washington, we have to do more. And so there's a pushback, and I don't know what the answer is, but...
Here's the thing. Just pure observer. Nobody's walking around with masks on in the United States, but they are in Beijing.
They are.
But they are in Beijing. China's a member, was full on board with the Paris Climate Accord. We weren't. But they're the ones with the pollution problem, right? I mean, there's a disconnect, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. I want to mention one thing because there's a big elephant in the room. One of the licenses we got in Tianjin was to trade energy efficiency, SO2, and water quality. And we haven't really talked about water, and I think that is ultimately perhaps even more pressing. China with 20% of the world's population and 7% of the water, and flip that around in the U.S., with 20% of the water and a third of the population. I think the challenges for China are going to be in water. I mean, 9 out of the 10 rivers that go through or originate in Tibet, but one questions the political ramifications of things like that. So I think in any discussion on climate, energy, economic growth, the water part really has to be included in that.
I think this is probably for Pin and for Deborah. How much of the technology being deployed on the ground to improve air quality in China is indigenous research, particularly battery technology, or where is most of this technology sourced from or purchased?
You want to go?
I don't know the specific percentages, but I think it's a combination. I think what we've seen is a big trend. Initially, a lot of the leading technology and innovation is coming from the United States, and the market is in China for it. And so they're being tested there. I know a number of green funds were set up in the United States, for example, and as far as I know, very few of them have been successful. In China, last week I was told there are now 250 green funds.
250 green funds.
250 green funds. And they're sourcing a lot of innovative thinking in how to address all of these different types of pollution, as you were saying. I mean, the air quality is the most visible and the one that was politically necessary and expedient for the Chinese government to address. But in addition to water, soil pollution is another major issue. And Goldman Sachs did a report recently, and they said that they saw that there was $1 trillion opportunity in environmental services in China. And you see a lot of companies rushing in to try.
But did you say most of them aren't profitable or aren't doing well? I didn't.
No, I was saying in the U.S. In the U.S., a lot of the green funds were not profitable. In China, a lot of these funds are government funds.
But the green funds in the U.S. are investing in China. I'm not understanding.
Oh, no, I was saying a number of green funds were initially set up in the United States, investing in the United States. And I think it's been very hard to find some in the early years that were profitable.
Got it. But ultimately, the ultimate answer to the question is...
How can they be profitable when there's not a market for the thing they're producing?
Yeah.
Right.
And until there is a price on carbon, it's going to be, that's widespread, which is right, there exists in California. It's going to be very hard. I think a lot of those were set up in the expectation that there would be markets.
Yeah, and hopefully, I mean, with all due respect, I think that the 7 pilot projects, and certainly led by Richard, what has been done in trying to price carbon in China is exceedingly impressive. But the reality is there's no market. It's more spot trading and kind of trading than it is any kind of real. There's no futures market yet. There's no national market yet.
Let me finish the thought, and I think that that's exactly right, and it isn't. I started to say earlier it's a 20-year curve. If I mark 2006 and the opening of our exchange, mark it to 2026. On October 31st, 2 days ago, They moved the emissions trading from NDRC, which is the real powerful guts, over to EPA, and everybody said, uh-oh, that's a slowdown. I happen to know that they moved the person, Su Wei and his assistant, Li Gao, from NDRC over to EPA 10 years ago. We said to them, you have to move this ultimately like the US, but the registry and the environmental part. And so I think the chatter in the business is allocation of permits come in July 2019. Simulated trading comes in 2021. And 21 CRC overlooks a futures, and they take the 7 pilot, they give them all equity, they start a new climate futures exchange, and by 2022 you're off to the races. So I think it's not a 0-1. I mean, they've been building human capital for 12 years in markets. And just remember that they never had financial futures until recently. This is a new thing for China. And the one thing that they needed to learn, which I think they didn't learn, is this is not like batteries where you build a blueprint and all of a sudden you can replicate that process if you have the blueprint in manufacturing. Capital markets are complex webs of regulation, rule books, contract design, and they've had a tough time in getting their organized markets because it's not like manufacturing. You need a whole different set of skills.
Okay.
Bearing in mind what that says, just to conclude, I think Deborah is right, but if we look at it at a continuum and say, given that it's a 20-year process, look to 2022 to a futures, you'll be in line, and look to implementation in 2025, and then we'll be able to judge whether this experiment on markets is going to work out.
Last word to Pinni.
Yeah, so I would say, there's a very big difference between the technology versus the economic tool or the market-driven system.
Sure.
So that part, I would 100% agree. China is at the very beginning of learning because they have the socialism system or whatever, so the government is everywhere. So the market force is not there yet, or not as much as we have. On the technology side, I would say it's a very different measurement. And clearly on the battery business, the technology is much more valuable in China for 2 reasons. One is the demand is much higher, okay? Mark, as you say, it's a 4 versus 1, right? So if you can sell 1, you can sell 4 there. Secondly, same thing, Michael, you said, is the low-hanging fruit, right? If for us to increase our life here for 6 years, that would be great. But I don't know what else we can do to get there. For Beijing, it's easy. You take this one out, you can live longer for 6 years. So it's very effective. So I give you an example. We bought the company, Deborah knows, called A123, is the battery company.
Yep.
So it was very controversial.
It was.
And we bought it January 2013. 2012, they lost $300 million.
Remember CFIUS review?
Yeah. They lost the $300 million. And then 2014, in the middle of 2014, we got invited to the White House, and we were greeted to say, oh, you guys did a fantastic job because only less than 18 months you turned the company around in a positive cash flow. So the policy is great, right? So it's a good policy. It can work. And honestly, it's really because it was China. Because that year, we shipped 75% of the volume to China. And we couldn't...
That would help cash flow if it went up that dramatically, right?
Yeah, we couldn't even keep up. For a few months, we air freight containers of the battery to China every single week. So in that way, I say, if I cannot make money, something got to be wrong. So that shows the demand is so huge. So just to answer the original question about technology, China, USA, I would say, we have a very big horsepower here in terms of the innovation, no doubt. We're dominating, in terms of the global market still today. but the demand is in China today.
Right.
So that's the balance.
You see from that photo that we started the whole panel with. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. This has been terrific. Good discussion, guys. Thank you very much.